Summer Reading is here. Visit summerreading.queenslibrary.org for our full summer reading program schedule, book lists for all ages, and other resources to keep your kids engaged and learning all summer long. Queens Public Library, along with the New York City Department of Education, will be providing free lunches for all children under 18 throughout the summertime. Summer meals will be offered Monday to Friday from 1 to 2 p.m. through August 31st. Enrollment is not required and there is no cost. For more information and a list of participating libraries, visit queenslibrary.org. You can take QPL with you wherever you are. Our digital materials, including e-magazines, e-books, and more, are available 24/7 from anywhere with an internet connection. Download the QPL mobile app at connect.queenslibrary.org.
Welcome to Queens Public Library's talk with Paul Fisher, author of the new book, The Man Who Invented Motion Pictures, a true tale of obsession, murder, and the movies. The Wall Street Journal writes, lively, it turns out that neither Edison nor the French-born Lumiere brothers, said to have been responsible in 1895 for the earliest commercial presentation of a film, deserve their reputations as prime movers of the medium. As Mr. Fisher documents with the rigor of a historian and the flair of a true crime writer, it was another Frenchman, Louis Le Prince, who in 1886 crossed the finish line first with his dual-camera projector system. Library Journal states, Fisher combines first-hand accounts with dynamic writing to bring the Victorian era to life. A remarkable cast of characters, including Le Prince's equally fascinating wife Lizzie, makes for compelling reading. Publishers Weekly declares, fascinating. Vivid character sketches, lyrical descriptions of the art and science of movie making, and a dramatic plot twist make this a must-read. Hi, I'm Brian Alessandro. For those of you who don't know me, I have written for Interview Magazine, Newsday, Enk, Huffington Post, and have recently adapted Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story into a graphic novel for Top Shelf Productions, which will be released this fall. Additionally, I recently co-edited Fever Spores, The Queer Reclamation of William S. Burroughs, an anthology of essays and interviews about Burroughs for Rebel Satori Press. I'm also the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the literary journal, The New Engagement. My first novel, The Unmentionable Man, was published in 2015 by Cairn Press, and my first feature film, Afghan Hound, was produced by Marriott Media in 2011. It is currently streaming on Plex and soon on Tubi. Culture Connection, curated by Daniel Zaleski and now in its 9th year at the Queens Public Library, is proud to present international artists from emerging talent to award-winning masters. These disciplines include music, theater, author talks, and film. Now expanding into a virtual format, Culture Connection is currently reaching a global audience. Paul Fisher is the author of A Kim Jong-il Production, which has been translated into 12 languages and appeared on numerous best-of lists in 2014. Fisher has written for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and The Independent. He's also a film producer. His screenplay for The Body was produced by Blumhouse and Hulu in 2018. Paul, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Hi, everyone.
It's my pleasure. So I think that your book is meticulously researched and as stirring as a film itself. I told you this earlier. For the longest time, most of us were led to believe that Thomas Edison and the Lumiere brothers created the motion picture in New Jersey in 1894 and Paris in 1895, respectively. History has that as Edison's machine could, correct me if I'm wrong, that Edison's machine could only screen for one person at a time, but the Lumiere brothers were able to project for an audience. But your book sheds light on a Frenchman in England named Louis Le Prince, who truly invented motion pictures in 1888. Can you please just give us a brief overview of this incredible story and tell us why we don't know Le Prince as the true inventor of cinema over 130 years later? Why did it take your book to educate us?
It's a weird thing, right? So I grew up in France, where it's essentially assumed that the Lumiere brothers invented film. And the argument I would hear as a kid is it's called cinema. Their machine was called the cinematograph. It starts with that, period. And the distinction the French have is that, yeah, Edison made films before the Lumiere brothers, but they couldn't be longer than a minute or two.
Mm-hmm.
You watched them on your own and they weren't projected. And so that doesn't count. And that's sort of assumed to be the way it is in France. And, you'd occasionally hear about, someone who supposedly had made a film before the Lumiere brothers or invented a machine that didn't work, but could have worked. And they were mostly all kind of really easy to dismiss, really. And so I've grown up with this idea of, okay, the French think the Lumiere brothers invented film. American school kids did generalize or thought that it's Thomas Edison because projection matters less than the actual moving image. And I'd never heard of Louis the Prince until I was in my, I guess, mid-20s. And I picked up this novel by a guy called Theodore Rorschach, who was a film scholar, but he'd also written this novel called Flicker, which is like a film-based Da Vinci Code, basically, that kind of assumes the whole history of film is an Illuminati conspiracy thing.
Wow.
And in the way conspiracy thrillers do this stuff, he kind of mixes in real life stuff with the stuff he makes up. And there's one bit in the book where, as I remember, the protagonist is being given the kind of 40 pages of exposition speech. And the guy who's giving it to him is like, well, there was this man called Louis the Prince who made the first film in 1888, but he disappeared because he was killed by the Illuminati, whatever. And I remember reading it and going, the Illuminati bit doesn't sound real, but I wonder if that Louis the Prince guy was a real guy.
Yeah.
And so I looked him up, and the thing that was immediately fascinating about Le Prince was he was a real guy. He did exist. The films he made still exist. You can watch them. The camera exists. The projector exists. He was given the patents. You can date the films to 1888 because someone in them died in 1888, so it couldn't have been any later. And so I remember even the first time I looked him up and started scrolling through the Science Museum website, because that's where they keep his stuff in England, thinking this is the opposite of one of those crackpot conspiracy theory, someone made a film, because I can't see the argument that he didn't.
Right.
But I've never heard of him, even though I'm obsessed with film.
Yeah, same. Until your book, honestly.
It's crazy because there's I never pretend I'm the first to do anything. So there has been a couple of books and there has been a couple of documentaries, and they come at it from different angles and kind of then break through. And I was always fascinated by this idea of there's no argument he made these films first. So why does no one know him? And the hook of Le Prince's story is he makes these first films in 1888. And then 18 months or so later, nearly 2 years later, he gets on a train in France when he's, by all accounts and by all documentation, he's about to make this invention public. He gets on a train in France and he disappears, and he's never seen or heard from again. And that goes unsolved for 130 years. Yeah. And because of the way it used to be at the time, if you go missing, for 7 years or until they find a body, no one can use your intellectual property. So all his work gets frozen. And in a tragic way, in that 7 years, Edison comes along, the Lumiere brothers come along. His family can't do anything in his name because he's not technically dead.
Right.
And he just gets sidelined completely.
It's actually a very emotional and frustrating story. I found myself becoming actually very aggravated and sad during the last few chapters for his family, for Lizzie and for his son. And it felt like an incredible crime had been committed, an intellectual, artistic crime too, on some level. In what ways did Le Prince believe that the motion picture camera would change the world and will alter the course of humankind? Because he did have these kind of grand ambitions for it, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that, as I'm obsessed with film, and it's one of the things that I really connected with him about while researching, because you read these histories of early cinema, and Edison had no idea how it worked, and he didn't get it. And there's letters from him, even after he was making money from the kinetoscope, writing to people going, I'm sure people are going to get bored of this at some point. It's stupid. I don't get it. And the Lumiere brothers in France, they premiered it and they thought it would be successful kind of for like a season. They were kind of like, it's a fun toy. People will get over it. When we make photographs color, that'll stick, but like moving whatever, no one cares. Whereas Le Prince, before them, he's kind of the only guy on the record who has notebooks filled with, and conversation records filled with, no, we're going to have what he called a people's theater. It's going to be a room with benches and a big screen, and it's going to be dark, and it's going to be immersive. And people will come and see stuff, and it can be anything. It could be educational, it could be therapeutic, it could be the news, it could be fiction, it could be entertainment. But it's gonna, I think his wife, I'm paraphrasing, but there's this great quote that Le Prince would say that once people watched movies, it would kind of end priestcraft and the power of kings, because there would be no superstition or divine right thing that you'd see. Someone lives this way on the other end of the world, and he actually kind of looks and sounds and moves like me. He's not that foreign. And he was convinced that there would be no war. And he was a veteran, but he was convinced that if you can film what happens to someone at war, mothers would just not let their kids go to war. They just be like, this isn't happening.
And what a terrible irony that the 20th century was like the bloodiest in the history of civilization.
Yeah. The flip side of kind of that is because he had that Victorian middle class thing, they only saw positivity and progress.
Sure.
There was no, like, I wonder if we'll have deep fakes in a century and a half, and that'll be weird. It was all like, this can only be amazing, and there's a pinch of ego there of, my invention will change the world.
Sure.
But he wasn't inventing it as a product, which was cool.
There was like a real sense of romance, honestly, from more so than with Edison or the Lumiere brothers. And we'll get to those in a minute. I especially was fascinated by the way there was the treatment of Edison and how you kind of subvert some of the perceptions that people have of him. I think by now, though, we know. We'll get to him. I don't want to sort of get ahead of myself. But what happened on January 12th, 1891, specifically regarding the newspaper headline, the kinetograph, Edison's latest and most surprising device, motion picture recorded and reproduced. What did Lizzie, the Prince's wife, think? How did the world react?
Well, this is the second hook of the Prince's story. So the Prince disappears in September 1890. And by virtue of the way communications work, it's kind of 4 or 5 weeks. He disappears in France. His wife's in America. He disappears on the way back to England. And so it's kind of 4 or 5 weeks of telegramming back and forth before anybody realizes something's wrong. Where Lizzie goes, I haven't had a letter from him in a while, so I'll telegram the guy in France. Guy in France goes, he left for England. Guy in England goes, I thought he was with you. So let's say November 1890, Lizzie realizes Le Prince has vanished completely and that she can't touch his invention. And January, is it 12th? You've got a better memory than I do, but January 12th, 1891, or early January 1891.
January 12th,
when she's still kind of looking for him, she opens up the New York Sun, I think it was, which was Edison's kind of favorite mouthpiece. And the front cover is this big headline that Thomas Edison, world famous, super genius, backed by bankers, has come up with this amazing thing no one could have conceived of. And it's a motion picture camera and projector that works exactly the way Le Prince has worked, at least to Lizzie's mind.
Yeah, sure.
And it's so close that Lizzie has friends kind of popping over, calling in, sending messages saying, oh, that's great, Louis working with Thomas Edison. I saw about Louis' invention in the paper. Is that not what Louis is working on? And so Edison even then had a reputation as a bit of a thief. And so Lizzie immediately makes the connection that maybe what happened to my husband is related to Thomas Edison suddenly claiming his invention. And from that point on, Lizzie and the rest of the family were convinced that Thomas Edison had a hand in getting rid of Le Prince to steal his invention, which was deepened obviously by her having to spend 7 years unable to do anything about it, but walking past, kinetoscope parlors with Thomas Edison busts in the lobby while he's raking the cash in.
It's like salt, a lot of salt in a very deep wound, and we're going to get specifically to how it affected his son and Lizzie a little bit later.
Sure.
How did Le Prince's involvement, in the Franco-Prussian War or the War of 1870 shape his worldview and further his ambition to create the motion picture camera? You intimated a bit earlier as to what he thought it would do.
Yeah, well, there's the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, 1871. It's kind of like the first modern war, in a sense that it's the first time that there's a war where people have such weapons that you can stand by a cannon outside Paris, fire that cannon into Paris, and kill people without ever having to see them or think about them. And Le Prince was a volunteer on the French side in that war, and he ended up getting stuck in Paris during the siege, where for several months during the winter, no one could come in or out. No one could communicate with anybody.
Hmm.
And he was a medic. And so he was involved in, burying soldiers, burying families who'd been bombed, civilian families, treating people getting ill and starving in the winter. And he came out of the war with a change in behavior that's really consistent with something the French were obsessed with at the time, which they called siege fever, which was basically this kind of restless, sometimes depressed, sometimes manic, sometimes obsessed with connecting with people, sometimes rejecting of authority, kind of, I guess, PTSD.
Yeah,
right?
that sounds like it. Yeah.
And the way I felt reading Le Prince's notes and the progression of the idea was that his experience of being in a siege of Paris and being unable to communicate with anybody and seeing all these horrible things and being unable to tell your family, I'm alive, I'm well, and being unable to hear from them, from his pregnant wife, I've given birth, everybody's well, kind of planted one of the seeds in his mind, which was that the next modern technology or idea would be something that could connect people over great distances or make it so no one would have to be separated in that way anymore. And when he stumbled across this idea of moving pictures, you get the sense in his notes and his letters and his correspondence that it wasn't just about capturing life, but it was about kind of bridging time and space as well, that you wouldn't be isolated from a dead loved one or a departed loved one or a distant loved one, because you could see them, move and talk and live on the world whenever you wanted.
So and then of course we as we said earlier, as I said earlier, it's sort of the 20th century didn't play out so sensitively or as compassionately. And you would think, I mean, having nothing to compare it to because it's a brand new invention, that if we could see the horrors that people can do to each other rather than just hear about it, it might hit us on a more visceral, empathetic level, and we would be less inclined to do horror to one another. But that was not the case, as we all know. I saw the trailer for this new film coming out by Jordan Peele called Nope. It opens next week, and it looks like the characters in the film reference The Horse in Motion by Edward Muybridge, which was 1878. It was through a series of cabinet cards he was able to project a jockey. Can you explain what cabinet cards are and who Muybridge, pronounce it again?
It's Muybridge, Edward Muybridge.
Muybridge was, and the circumstances of this presentation, and also what became of Muybridge.
Yeah, of course. Edward
Muybridge, it's kind of a dark story.
Yeah, he was an English photographer, kind of amazing. Kind of had he called, it's cool because he's almost like a weird Victorian supervillain, superhero slash thing. Because he would change his name all the time, and he had a superhero name. Like he called himself Helios, like the sun, when he took photographs. And he'd never been interested in photography. He was selling books in San Francisco until one day he was going overland journey in a coach, and the coach had a terrible accident, and he had some kind of skull brain injury thing that completely changed his personality and made him isolated and erratic and egomaniacal. And while he was back in England recovering from this terrible crash, he's treated by this doctor called Edward Gull, who I always love mentioning because he's one of the prime suspects for who might have been Jack the Ripper.
Oh, yeah, that's
because he was like the royal surgeon. But he gets treated by Edward Gull, and Edward Gull does that doctor thing of going, maybe, while you're recovering, pick up a hobby, photography. People like photography. It's calming. So Muybridge picks up photography, loves it, has a real talent for it, especially kind of like big vistas and stuff. And he goes back to America with this new name, Helios, and he opens a photography studio, and he does very well. And he takes kind of a great range of pictures, portraits, journalistic pictures, great kind of Ansel Adams nature vistas. And then one day he's hired by Leland Stanford, of the school and of the railways and of kind of corrupt reputation. Because Stanford owns horses, loves horses, and he's got this debate with his cigar smoking buddies, which is when a horse is trotting, are all four hooves off the ground at any point, or do they always have contact?
Mm.
And no one could tell, because at the time, which is, early 1870s, I think, when he hires Muybridge, it's impossible to take a picture quick enough to be able to tell. It's all a blurry mess.
Sure.
Because you need people to stand still so the whole thing can work.
Right.
And so Muybridge takes up this challenge, and his contribution to photography, to movies really, is he becomes the first person who figures out a way to take a picture so quickly that you can take it in what they called an instant, to be inaccurate, but they called it instantaneous photography. And he realized that if you can take a picture in an instant, and if you take a bunch of pictures in an instant, and then you play those instants back to back, it might look like it's just continuous movement.
Mm.
And so Muybridge didn't have one camera that could do that enough, but he could do a thing where he could put a row of still cameras kind of one next to the other, essentially extend a string, let's say, from each camera across the track, and then the horse would run across, trip each wire, that would take an instant photograph.
Mm-hmm.
And then as long as the horse was in front of a white background, kind of like a green screen, he could then put that on like a circular drum thing, each card printed. And if you cut slats to look through to kind of create separation where you wanted, you could then spin that drum and it would look like it was moving. That was kind of how zoetropes worked.
Zoetrope, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Muybridge worked that if you took that principle and projected it, you could kind of make that work, but in projection. And so his contribution to cinematography was really that, there was that thing that, you can project moving images and it looks amazing, because people are used to magic lanterns where you can project still images, but you can properly project moving images, even if they were just the same second on a loop, which is what he could do.
Sure.
And it was also, now that we can take pictures in one instant, then we can take enough to kind of have continuous persistence to vision. And Muybridge's thing, after that, he was on trial for murder because he killed his wife's lover, and he was accused by Stanford in one of the early kind of, rich guy going, well, no, that's actually a work for hire, I own it things.
I was saying earlier that your book reads like a film, a very compelling drama. And, I'm reading about Muybridge and I'm like, this is really fascinating. And then it all of a sudden culminates in this horrible crime, which really caught me unawares. And it was very
well, cool. One thing that's kind of I can't cover that much time on Muybridge because the book's not about him, but Rebecca Solnit has written an amazing book about him that's pretty slim, super in detail, very atmospheric. And, if that sounds like a fascinating life, which it was, that book's amazing. Good.
Thank you for that recommendation.
Yeah.
Tell us about Lefranc's Spark in 1880. Le Prince's Spark in 1880 and the circumstances surrounding it. You describe it as the spark. You called it the spark.
Yeah. So Le Prince, having grown up in France, he was one of those middle class, kind of sort of well-to-do petit bourgeois guys who he loved the arts and he kind of loved the new sciences and he studied optics, chemistry, but he didn't know what to do with his life until he marries an English woman called Elizabeth Lizzie Whitley. Right. And Lizzie's from a family of industrialists in Leeds in England, which was one of the great cities that drove the Industrial Revolution. And Lizzie's dad, Joseph, was one of those people who had grown up in a tenement, 8 brothers and sisters crammed into really horrible conditions, infant mortality, sewage in the streets, no upward mobility. But he was born in a generation where people could do something out of their ideas. He invented a boiler valve that was more efficient than other ones, patented it, and suddenly he was a wealthy man because he turned an idea into hard cash. And so Le Prince arrives in Leeds and he gets into this family, and it turns out that even though he's a posh French dude, he really loves the factory floor and rolling up his sleeves. And he loves this idea that if you come up with something no one else has, because it's the Industrial Revolution, you can patent it, you can own it, you can get rich on it, you can get famous on it. And so he experiments with a bunch of different stuff, kind of around photography, because he was obsessed with photography, obsessed with chemistry and developing images. And one of the things he had some kind of local success doing was firing photographs onto plates and cups, and kind of, if you picture like coronation tea sets with Elizabeth's face on them, he would do that kind of thing 100 years, or like 75 years before that. And a lot of that was compositing pictures. So kind of like, taking Queen Victoria from this picture, taking Prince Albert from that picture, putting them together so it looks like they're in the same picture.
That's interesting.
And one day he's in the lab and he's manipulating these images to do this thing, and he's holding two images he's going to composite together, and they slip out of his hand on glass plates, probably, because I remember he says exactly the medium, but they slip out of his hand, and in that moment of catching them, the movement in the image makes him think that the person in the image is moving, because it's two images, one after the other, and it looks like that person's kind of jerking down as they fall. And as he and Lizzie remembered it, immediately he thought, this is a thing. If I can find a way to turn this accident into a purposeful recreation of this, then I can make images move, which to Victorian people was a huge deal, because the anima, which is after animation, is the soul, and the idea was motion is life, and you can make something move. If you can make the image of something move, you're God. You're giving emotion. You're creating it.
That was a godlike invention, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was the beginning of, I guess 7-8 years of trying to make that chance idea, that spark, take.
Simon & Schuster, your publisher, sent us your book contains numerous beautiful photos, archival photos, and Simon & Schuster sent us a few. So I wonder if we could just sort of show them, and you can walk us through and narrate. So here's a portrait of Le Prince, right?
Yeah, that's Le Prince in the 1880s, kind of when he was working on cinema in the early years. This is kind of the way I imagine him in my head when I write, even though he was a bit older when he disappeared. This is my main argument for how you can't make this into a movie, because I can't think of anybody else who can pull off the beard. Seriously.
Daniel Day-Lewis could have, but he retired, right? So
Daniel Day-Lewis could, he could pull off anything, I guess.
Yeah.
This is interesting. So this is, Le Prince worked on a bunch of cameras, and there would be combination camera projectors, a camera and a projector. He'd have 3 lenses, 4 lenses, 18 lenses. And this is, I guess they call it the Mark II, but it's his second camera with a single lens, which is, to a lot of people, one of the requirements for a real motion picture is everything comes through the same point of view. And this is actually, I think, the back of the camera. And a lot of people look at this camera and go, well, that's not a single lens camera. It's got 2, but those are actually viewfinders, if that makes sense. Yes. So the lens is on the other side, and it's kind of this big mahogany cabinet that, like most early cameras, is really hard to move around.
It's very heavy.
The machinery was pretty intense.
Sure.
Yeah, and it's got these 3 hooks at the bottom, because he would have needed a plate and a massive heavy bipod with weights to steady it when filming. But that still exists. It's in a museum in Bradford. That's the inside of it.
Okay, so this is the reverse. Okay, this is in Bradford, you're saying, right now?
Yeah, so the National Science Museum in Bradford, which is in Yorkshire in England, they have this, and they have scraps of film, and they restore these films, and they have the drums, like these drums. So this is, weirdly, because we think of cameras loading from the back, this is the front of the camera.
Okay.
So that's your lens at the top. And the thing about Le Prince's cameras is this is kind of the first camera that is recognizably a film camera, if that makes sense, which you'll know because we've talked about loading film and stuff.
Sure.
That, you spool it here, it goes in front of the lens, and then it respools on the other thing, and it holds it in there, and then you have to empty it out in a bag with a shroud over it so it doesn't get exposed, and transfer it over and develop it. Yeah. And weirdly, a really simple mechanism, because he worked for a really long time. When Le Prince started working on motion pictures, which is Kodak film, didn't exist. People shot photographs on glass plates.
Right.
And you can imagine, if you're trying to make 15 glass plates go through a camera in a second, you're just ending with a lot of shattered glass.
Sure.
And then they had paper rolls, but the paper would rip and catch fire and all this different stuff. And this was probably one of the early, kind of films. As you can see, it looks like film, which is essentially translucent plastic. And they look like projection reels, but these were reels that Le Prince would use to store the film, either before it was developed or after, or before it was used or after it was developed. And again, like just a lot of the people who try to tinker, you look at Muybridge's stuff and it looks like an optical trick toy. It doesn't look like a film device. But this, before I'd written this, somebody went, "Oh, that's projector reels from 1968." I would have gone, "Oh, okay, that looks about right."
That's great. Such great images. And these are just 4 or 5 of the images. You have something like 30 in the book. So it's a treat for those who go ahead and seek it out. You'll all get to see what else is contained in here. And it's all very revelatory. I'm sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Thank you. No, I was just going to say, for sure, because I was trying to be Eric Larson, who I love, who writes kind of true crime Victorian stuff. He doesn't have pictures in his books, right? Because he has this thing of, I'm going to describe it, the picture's just getting in the way. And I remember starting and having this really pretentious idea of, I'm going to do that. And then my editor would go, "You could just put in a picture of the camera, and then you don't need 9 pages of describing technical stuff that no one is going to read." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, I'll have the pictures."
And it's really exciting to see, honestly, to thumb through.
It is too. That's true.
I have to share a quote from your book about Edison. Despite dedicating his days to chasing that high, to the pursuit of one final wonder to be adored for, he would try mining and automobile batteries, radiology and chemistry. The closest Thomas Edison would come to success was with motion pictures. And then you credit William Kennedy, Laurie Dixon with much of it. Who is William Dixon, and how did he help Edison achieve success with the motion picture camera?
Edison kind of he has 2 periods in his creative life. There's this 1870s where he works for Western Union, improves the telegraph, first becomes rich, first becomes famous, announces the phonograph, which doesn't really work, but well enough to demonstrate it and to have people see it and go, "Oh, wow, you can capture a voice. That's amazing."
Yeah.
And that's phase 1, where he's just pull yourself up by the bootstraps, genius, celebrated, representative of the American spirit, Thomas Edison. By the time, kind of a Menlo Park Edison, really. By the time this stuff happens, which is mid 1880s, Edison's in a weird kind of dry spell where he's, from the highs of announcing the phonograph, he can't sell it because the thing doesn't work well enough to be sold. And he's constantly in newspapers going, "I'm coming up with this and I'm coming up with that. I've finished inventing this," but then he's never able to put it out because he's overpromising and he hasn't finished. And so even the newspapers at the time kind of make fun of him for being full of it. And, I always like transposing stuff to modern times. And he was kind of in like the tabloid press equivalent to people on Twitter going, "Oh, wow, it looks like Elon Musk's monorail thing, just a hole in the ground. Well, that's disappointing."
Yeah.
They would do that about Edison.
Sure.
And
I was making
at this. Yeah. He was at this point where people kind of like were making fun of him, but he was also super famous. He was one of those tall poppies to be cut down, whatever the Australian expression is. And he's financed by JP Morgan and all these bankers. And he's not really inventing anymore. He's managing a company that has his name on it, and it has a bunch of, he called them muckers, which are basically inventors and engineers and scientists and chemists in West Orange in New Jersey. And W.K.L. Dixon, William Dixon, was an Englishman, Scotsman, I guess. I should be careful there, Scotsman, who had come to America to work for Edison because he just admired and loved him from that first period. And he starts as Edison's photographer, kind of bounces, or he starts actually in one of the labs downtown Manhattan, works alongside Tesla and these other people for a while, wiring for electricity, then bounces around, becomes Edison's photographer. And then Edison meets Edward Muybridge. And Muybridge does one of his shows with the horse, and Edison goes to see it in West Orange. And then Muybridge asks to meet Edison, and they meet. And Muybridge says, if we could combine my moving images with your phonograph, then we could have stuff that moves and talks.
Yeah.
And that's killer.
Yeah.
And Edison, in a very Edison way, thinks that sounds amazing, says, "Yeah, that sounds boring." And the second Muybridge is gone, Edison goes, "I'm going to do exactly that, but without Edward Muybridge, because I don't need him."
Scoundrel.
Which was a very Edison-y thing.
Yeah. And I want one more quote very quickly, Paul, that I pulled from you that speaks directly to this point. Edison worked best when he identified existing inventions and improved on them. And in truth, his original ideas were rare. He also felt a pressure to create, to deliver. I think that's what you're saying. Exactly.
That's exactly where he's at. And to a lot of people, that sounds like, well, he just steals other people's ideas. ideas. And to me, that sounds like, yeah, kind of sometimes, and sometimes also he's an amazing practical mind.
Mm-hmm.
And someone could go, I have this vision, and he could go, well, I can put it together through nuts and bolts. And Edison's argument would have been Edward Muybridge could never bring the images to me that he said he would, and he probably couldn't, and he never did. And he could do a 1 second loop of a horse on a flat background. Anyway, so Edison's like, I'm going to do this without Muybridge, and I'm going to do this means I'm going to tell one of my guys who's on a work for hire contract in
Mm-hmm.
modern terms
Mm-hmm.
to figure it out for me. And then, everybody has agreed whatever you invent at the lab is the property of the lab. It's the
Mm-hmm.
Edison name on the patent. So Dixon is the guy, because he's his photographer, that he tasks with inventing the movies. And so Dixon, the kinetoscope and the kinetograph are Dixon inventions. And Dixon actually was the only person who ever shared a patent with Edison, that Edison ever agreed to put a name on a patent for. So that's where Dixon fits in.
So generous. Tell us about the Merrimack and Monitor naval battle panorama from 1885. This was kind of a big deal, right? I mean,
it was a huge deal, yeah.
It helped sort of fuel LePrince's passions, right, and career.
Yeah. Like I always say about LePrince, he was kind of trained for nothing except inventing this one medium, because he had all these weird experiences of he was a great painter and he loved photography, and he studied kind of optics, the way the eye works, and also chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
All these different things that don't really connect to one another, except the Venn diagram kind of meets with moving pictures. And one of the things in that Venn diagram is there was an entertainment at that time in the US, especially France as well, called panoramas.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of a panorama was you would walk into a warehouse or an empty building or whatever, and in that building, these artists and I guess mechanics would have built a kind of wraparound 360-degree gigantic scene made out of connected paintings, and supplemented with animatronics and smells and sounds and lights and smoke to make you feel like you were stepping back in time into, whatever they were trying to represent. And travel scenes were popular to start with. And then wartime battles became really popular because people in the 1880s were fascinated, especially with the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And there was all this trauma about the Civil War to kind of exercise.
Sure.
And people, weirdly, the way we do with entertainment, loved being able to, come off Madison Avenue, walk into a building, and suddenly you're surrounded by the sounds of battle, dead people on fake ground, and just like the most immersive art form they had at the time. And LePrince, who really had no connection to that art form, his wife had studied painting with a guy whose brother, I believe, or whose son-in-law, some kind of one of those weird connections, was the greatest French producer of panoramas, called Theo Pralpo. And Pralpo comes to New York to do his first one, and he doesn't speak a word of English. And he's asking around for someone who can be his interpreter. And someone goes, oh, well, Lizzie's husband is out there, and he speaks English really well, and he speaks French, and so I'll hook you up. And so LePrince becomes the manager on Merrimack and Monitor, which is a panorama of a really famous naval battle in the Carolinas, I think. And that he was already working on movies at the time, and he was figuring out what this thing would be. And that fed into his idea of, oh, this is super popular. Like, this ran for months and months. And it's just paintings and like tricks of the eye. If you can actually do this, where on a huge screen, you can have actual moving images in the dark that people experience together because they bring their own kind of shared communal experience to it. If I could do that with moving images, then I've got something that's better than even this. And this is the biggest show in town.
Sure. Wow.
And also allowed him to observe how people were kind of in the dark and what they would buy into and what they wouldn't, and how suspension of disbelief worked.
So these are all like very formative experiences for him.
But they're also random. Do you know what I mean? Like in that weird
chance, right? By
yeah.
chance. The most stressful part of your book was the patent stuff.
Tell me. It was stressful to write.
Yeah. Can you? It's a lot, but can you kind of give us a very sort of brief overview of all the challenges that LePrince trying to get a patent, and the patent office being as sort of difficult as they were.
Yeah. Well, so a patent, I know this sounds obvious, but it's kind of helpful to kind of start with. A patent is a piece of paper that says you own something. You're the first one to have ever made it or designed it. And so you've got a monopoly. At the time, it was 14 years. I can't say that I know what it is now. For 14 years, you're the only person who can make that thing and make money off that thing.
Before you continue, Paul, very quickly. Yeah. And then Edison was also famous for pre-patents, right? Something called a caveat, was it?
Exactly, yeah. So the spirit of the system was you come up with something, and like Abraham Lincoln was a big fan of this, and he rightfully was like, America is going to get rich off of this because we found a way to turn ideas into money. Because before patent systems or patent law, you come up with something, somebody sees it, they go, great, I'm building my own whatever. But now you can monetize ideas. So the idea of a patent, you come up with something, you can prove that it works, you're the first one to do it, you own it, you can make money from it. The way it kind of worked in Le Prince's time was actually kind of super unhelpful in the sense that you needed a patent to monetize something, but you also needed to get to the point where if you applied for a patent, the thing was far along enough that you could make it right away, because the second you have a patent, that gets published, and then everybody basically has the recipe to your invention.
Right.
So Edison, for instance, was famous for just collecting the Scientific American in his library, because that would publish every published patent.
Sure.
And anything that sounded interesting, you could go call up the full description, and then you basically had a user manual to make it. So an inventor like Le Prince would have gone, I really need a patent to protect my rights, but I also need to get it at the right time, because if I'm not ready to start making the machine, then somebody else could do it. And then it's up to the courts to work out what's what, and that's a gamble. So that was complicated enough. But the system had also got really kind of pretzeled into weirdness, in the sense that the technology was moving so quickly that the guys at the patent office, their requirements for what was new couldn't keep up with what was new, if that makes sense. So in Le Prince's example, he struggled for years to get the US Patent Office to accept his patent, because he would go, I've invented a thing to capture moving images and project them. And the patent office would go, okay, so you got to file one for the still camera and one for the projector. And he'd go, but it's not either. They got to work together. And he'd go, you got to do it separately. And so he'd file for the still camera, and it'd go, well, somebody's already got a still camera. And he's like, yeah, but it's not that. It's to work with that thing. And so, yeah, there'd be a struggle, because you have to explain something new. Mm-hmm. And show how it's new to a bureaucracy that's designed to kind of put stuff in boxes that are defined by what already exists.
Exactly.
So there was that aspect of it. And then there was the aspect that some people went, well, look, I've got an idea for something, and it's a new idea, and I can probably make it work, but it's going to take me time, and I don't have money, and I need to have a window where I can figure it out. And so patent law at the time went, okay, we'll invent a thing called a caveat or a pre-patent, mm-hmm. where you can basically call dibs on something. You can go, I've got this idea for motion pictures. It basically works on this principle. It's going to take me a long time on my teacher's salary to figure it out. So I want you to give me a bit of a heads up. And so the patent office went, that's fair. If you have a situation like that, we'll give you a pre-patent. And if anybody else comes along and says, I've actually made the thing, we'll give you a chance to kind of lay claim to it first. Mm-hmm. And that really quickly got perverted by people like Thomas Edison, who had a ton of cash, who would just read every scientific journal. And literally at the end of the year, Edison would just file 100 caveats over everything and anything, stuff he was never going to work on, stuff he had no idea how it worked, stuff he had no interest in, just to kind of plant a flag in it. And then if somebody else actually came up with it, he had all these employees and JP Morgan money to read their patents, go, okay, let's make a version of that that's different enough, and then we can go, we came up with it first. And he made bank doing that kind of thing, where he would just,
and just unscrupulous, right? But finally, the relief came, at least for me as the reader, to see that on December 22nd, 1887, Le Prince finally did receive his American patent for the invention, improvement in the method of an apparatus for producing animated pictures of natural scenery and life.
Yeah.
right?
That ended up being the niche he could fit into.
Yeah. So you talk about bureaucracy, right? I mean, at least they were able to find a box to check and put him into. 1887 also was like a pretty big year in terms of motion picture development. What was going on that was so sort of notable aside from that moment in LaPrince's life? What other things were happening? You have this wonderful paragraph. Can I just read it very quickly?
Yeah, please, so you can remind me what happened, because I have amnesia.
On page 200, the road to motion pictures in 1887 was in its endgame. Dozens of discoveries over hundreds of years, from the camera obscura and Ambromini to the discovery of silver nitrate and silver chloride, to photography, to studies of optics and flicker fusion, to the zoetrope and the magic lantern, all the way to Muybridge's instantaneous snapshots, Mary's chrono photographs, and Eastman's paper film and rolls, had dovetailed to this moment when the invention of a machine that could capture and project genuinely lifelike moving images was no longer a pipe dream, not even just a possibility, but imminent and inescapable. This is an incredible paragraph, really rousing. And it kind of brings all these roads into this one moment or this one year, which was also LaPrince's year on some level, like towards the very tail end of it, the last 2 weeks of
For
the
sure.
Yeah, it all it happened for him on that level.
Yeah, and it's the year, I could get confused on this because I have a weird kind of, I get obsessed with stuff and then I flush it out of my system when I'm working.
Sure, I get it.
But I think 1887, and this is disputed, right? Because some people say, or used to say, this isn't possible, and then you find stuff. But 1887 was also when celluloid kind of started being marketed as a medium, which is really important, right? So you get, the way we write about invention and innovation usually is, great, usually male, genius, has a vision, works through everything, comes up with the thing, we're all thankful, technology moves on, progress. When actually the reality of it is stuff's kind of in the air, because there's all these incremental things that move towards, oh, wow, if I can take pictures in an instant, and if we have projectors, then I could do this. And also I read that guy's paper about how the eye connects stuff. And so it's all incremental. And so in 1887, when LaPrince is trying to get this patent and is growing increasingly frustrated and paranoid and kind of urgent, there's Muybridge, who's getting motion pictures in his own way for his little shows. And there's a French scientist called Jules-Étienne Marey, who's like, he's got a gun, like not even a camera. He's got a gun that rotates drums, and he can take all his pictures and basically just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's his pictures. And he has no interest in projection. He's just a scientist who's fascinated by how the body moves and wants to, get birds, animals kind of captured. And so all these people are coming to motion pictures in a different way, but they're all struggling with the glass plates that break, the paper that rips. And at the same time, there's these guys, there's called the Hyatt brothers in New York, who have this plastic, the first industrial plastic you can just make in a factory, called celluloid. And it's really, really versatile, which means they have no idea what to do with it. They're like, we can make billiard balls, I guess, teeth, collars, I don't know, what's cheaper. And it never sticks until this reverend nearby called Reverend Goodwin, who's kind of dabbles in photography, hears about celluloid, and he goes, oh, well, it sounds tough and it sounds flexible and it sounds transparent. And if I could find a way to use that in a roll in my camera, then it'll be better than the paper ones, because it'll never break. It'll be faster. It'll take better pictures. And so he patents a version of celluloid film that would use that plastic in photography. And at the same time, there's a guy just up the river in Rochester called George Eastman, who's got this company called Kodak, and he's making these cameras, and he's really determined to have the next hot thing. That photography is this thing where you've got the thing that goes, and you've got, your glass plates, and you've got to develop it yourself, and it's really complicated. We've got this little Kodak camera that has paper rolls in it, but you can take your pictures, send it to the factory, we'll develop it for you, but it's not great. It would be great to have an improvement on that. And then here's of Goodwin, and like, oh, we could use a celluloid film to do that. And so all of this, none of this has anything to do with motion pictures, right? Because there's basically 12 dudes in the world who need film that works for motion pictures.
Sure, at that time, right?
But because all these different people are trying to come up with something for their own means, then suddenly in 1887, 1888, people like Le Prince who read the technical papers go, there's a film that does what? That's exactly what I need.
Yeah.
And it kind of turns, I always think about it, in the Tour de France where people are going pretty fast.
Sure.
And then in the sprint, it suddenly gets much faster.
Yeah.
Celluloid is kind of the start of the sprint for film because they'd all got as far as they could without somebody inventing something they could actually use to put the images on.
Like reach like a critical mass or something and then just blast
it
from there. We should definitely mention the Roundhay garden scene, right? Which is technically, for all intents and purposes, the first motion picture.
I guess the most precise way is the oldest surviving picture. I guess it's possible.
Picture, October 14th, 1888. Can you just give us a very brief summary of? It was just basically family members, right?
Yeah, it's Le Prince's in-laws, his son, and a friend of his in-laws walking around in circles in a Roundhay, which was a family kind of villa in Leeds, and doing silly walks. And it looks really simple. I guess it was the idea, I think, was for them to march in depth. So he could show this isn't Muybridge's horse on a green screen. This is people in real life going back and forth. It's not repeated movement. It's real movement. But you look at it and it's like, it's a home video of just people doing goofy stuff in the backyard.
But there had been nothing like it before. So
nothing like it before. And it's amazing because there's a letter, the Le Prince's mother-in-law, after they filmed that thing, falls ill.
Right.
And so there's actually a letter from Annie, who was the friend who was in that film, dated saying, we filmed this on this day after church. And then, Sarah got sick and felt unwell. And then Sarah Whitley, who's Le Prince's mother-in-law, dies late October, I think, early November. And so that was one of the things in court later when people went, well, you could have shot this anytime. Where the Le Princes went, well, no, because she was dead 2 weeks later. And we have this letter, so you can see there was exactly this date. And so that's how we can date precisely that, the first film, the oldest surviving film we have, this little home video was shot at this place. There's even someone in England who kind of tried to extrapolate at what time it would have been shot from the letter and from the light and everything.
How many, Paul, how many films, to your knowledge, did Le Prince make, and which have survived and can be seen still?
There's kind of three canonical ones, if that makes sense, because there's one he shot in 1887 that there's fragments of that survive, but it was almost certainly shot with his camera that had 16 lenses. Mm-hmm. His idea being at the time that if I've got the paper roll or the glass things, if I've actually got 16 different lenses going, then I can kind of fake that it's the same point of view. And it turned out that didn't work. He could get the images that fast, but you would see that the background is kind of hopping and moving. So that one doesn't count, but it's of a guy walking out of a factory in France. The three that kind of survive is he took two on that day in October, which was the Roundhay garden scene, which is the people walking around in a circle, and then a very short one of his son Adolphe playing the melodeon, the accordion. And someone pointed out to me the other day that I talk of the Roundhay garden scene as the first film, but I write in the book that he almost certainly shot the accordion one before the Roundhay one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so technically, shouldn't that be the first one? And it's a whole thing that, the number of frames that survive and how we can assume of how many they shot, it kind of feels like the Roundhay one is the one that counts. And then there's another one that's really amazing that he shot a few weeks later that people call Leeds Bridge, just because it was shot from a second story, I think, window at the end of Leeds Bridge over the river that goes through Leeds. And it's really just a film of traffic. And there's a few seconds that survive, like the Roundhay garden scene. And it's amazing because those few seconds survive. They're good. And for the time, they're pretty clear. Mm-hmm. Like you can see a guy smoking his pipe and you can see somebody talking to their family member and you can see the stuff going on. Like it's pretty detailed.
Where can people find these? Are they on YouTube? Have they been uploaded?
I guess the honorable legal thing is the Science Museum in Bradford has them and you can see them on their website.
Okay.
But they're all over YouTube. And if anything, there's amazing versions on YouTube where, kids these days who are good with computers will have done like restored version of them, like colorized or sharpened or HDized versions. And so there are like rabbit holes you can go down of watching it in the restored fragments as they survive, but then also watching people who've like put color and music and restoration to them.
Wow, we could definitely have like a Le Prince binge. We'll we'll Le Prince binge and chill. We'll be taking questions for Paul in a few minutes, so please start sending them in. You can put them into the chat. And while we wait for those questions to come in, Paul, I actually still have a few of my own left over. So your book really does get into a lot of it gets into a legal dispute, right? At some point, Lizzie and Le Prince's son try to hold Edison accountable. And can you just give us while we wait for questions, just tell us how that ended up for them? There was an appeals at some point as well.
There was, yeah. So by the end of the 1890s, Edison gets really greedy in the way he could, and he goes, you know what? These Frenchmen who were making films, I was first. I didn't just invent this machine. I invented the whole goddamn medium. And so he starts trying to lay claim to moving images in general. And ironically, the other biggest company in the United States at the time, which is called Biograph and Mutoscope, Biograph for short, has Dixon, who used to work for Edison, but left under acrimonious circumstances, went to this other company, and now makes better motion pictures than Edison does. And so Edison takes down all these smaller companies by threatening them with lawsuits. And eventually he gets around to the blue whale, which is Biograph, and which is Dixon. And he sues them to say, you can't make any films. I invented the whole medium. It's mine. And Dixon and the guys at Biograph go, well, there's this old patent by a guy called Louis Le Prince. And if we can convince a judge that that patent is motion pictures, that it completely invalidates Edison's claim because it shows that somebody got there before him. So how can you invent a medium that somebody invented before him? And so they come to Lizzie, come to Adolf, who's Louis' son, and they say, look, if you could testify in these hearings, it would help restore your dad's legacy, because you would have a judge say, you actually invented what Thomas Edison claims to have invented. And that's a big deal. And so the princes go to court to testify against this. And what happens is they kind of get caught up, because the truth is Biograph just want to use them, because Biograph, they don't want the judge to go, oh yeah, Louis Le Prince invented the movies. You actually owe him money. They want Biograph, they want the judge to just invalidate Edison and say, well, I guess it's everyone's. And so they get chewed up and spat out, really, in that process. And that lawsuit is cool because it's a lawsuit that, to kind of shorten, gets us Hollywood in the end. Because Edison wins and then loses on appeal and then wins again and then does some shenanigans and then wins again. And essentially gets to a point in the early 1900s where he controls the whole industry in New York. And every other producer goes, let's get out of here. Let's go to California. It's sunny. It's cheap. It's got mountains and the beach and everything. They don't care about copyright law. He's not going to bother us out there. And so people pick up and move and happen to settle around this little town called Hollywood.
Interesting. And that in and of itself can make an epic story. Just that moment led to the invention of this industry in America. And then, of course, we should say that even Alan Pinkerton shows up in your book at a certain point. I mean, like a lot of wealthy, powerful business people, Pinkerton was doing like sleuth work, right, on behalf of him as well. So I know that's a can of worms. I'd love to pick your brain about that, but a couple of questions are coming in. The film industry has come a long way since 1887. Where would you like to see it go from here?
Eileen, that's a good question. I don't know. I love the power of the movies. I love the kind of, I don't know. I have this hope kind of that that I guess it'll be a bit more like Le Prince made films where anybody can make a film and the film can be great, and that it doesn't have to be, you know, because I've always thought of the invention of films as a technological thing. It was these people invented a product, and films had to be made at scale until we got Super 8 cameras. And Le Prince is the opposite, where you kind of go, oh no, the first film was a home video made by one guy. And that's kind of liberating. But I also love the communal experience of going to the cinema. Sure. And I'm okay if that's like going to a concert and most of the films you watch are like listening to music on Spotify. But the thing you remember forever is going to the movies, like it is going to see Springsteen.
experience. Yeah, exactly. Sure. It's hard to replicate that in your living room.
Yeah, so I hope we have that combination of more people making movies, and it's not about money, but we can also enjoy them together.
Here's another question. Which of the various theories regarding Le Prince's disappearance do you find the most likely?
I've got one that I'm convinced is what happened. And it's at the end of the book, and I worked really hard to dig it up, and I had 4 researchers in like 3 different countries.
Wow.
And it's where it's not the obvious one, but I remember getting to it and going, oh yeah, that's such an obvious one. It's obviously what happened. And so the last chapter of the book makes my case for that. And I'm like 99% sure that's the one.
Okay, so get the book and read the last chapter, and you'll get Paul's answer.
Yeah, exactly. This is me playing hard to get.
Can you tell us how long it took you to write your book, Paul? Which archives and libraries did you use for your research? Do you know what your next book will be yet?
Yeah, sure, Albert. So I told my agent and my publisher to take me 2 years, and it took 4. And it was kind of a huge spread of stuff because I get really obsessed that I'm going to miss something and it's going to make me look like an idiot. And so on my first book and on this book, I kind of only stopped when they went, look, you got to give us something or we're not paying you. And then I was like, okay, I'm stopping. And so the stuff I'd start with that's all in Leeds at the Leeds University Library is they have Whitley family papers, Le Prince's surviving notebooks, Le Prince's surviving letters, correspondence, all that kind of stuff. And then at the Science Museum in Bradford, they have the actual machines and devices. And then you can obviously really easily look up his patents and try and work out how machines worked. And then there were a few sources around him that Lizzie wrote an unpublished memoir, which she wrote in the 1920s, I assume. It's undated. And which she wrote at that point, she was bitter and broken and kind of older, and just there's vitriol in that memoir because she was convinced Edison had gotten away with something and she'd been cheated. And so there's a lot in that that's not reliable, but there's a lot of stuff that's useful. And so I took all of that stuff and then using that as a starting point, I had my kind of cast of characters, and I would go, okay, there's Le Prince, there's his wife, there's his family, there's his brother, there's Edison, there's all these people. So for the more famous people like Edison, I can go to Paul Israel at the Edison papers at Rutgers and go, hey, I need stuff about this. And for instance, he was really helpful where you'd go, oh, we haven't digitized that stuff. Here's a mammoth PDF with everything we're putting online next year. And I could go through that. And, you know, people like Muybridge, I could do the reading and I could go to the old newspapers, but I could also ask people who'd written books about him, like Martha Braun, hey, does this make sense to you? Or can I check this with you? And the thing about writing about film is people are generally super helpful.
That's great.
And so for the famous people, I do it that way. For the people like Le Prince and his family members and everything, it became, I'm going to try and find everything. So I'm going to start, and this sounds really amateurish, but it's the most helpful thing in the world. I'm going to start on Ancestry.com. I'm going to plug in that name. I'm going to plug in the birthdays, and, you know, suddenly you get ship records and immigration records and census data and financial data and court records, and it's all hooked up in there. And then from there you branch out to, you know, I'd have someone in France looking up marriage contracts for Le Prince's family's members.
How many researchers in all did you end up working with?
I had 4 because I got to the point where you go, okay, with this advance, is it cheaper for me to go somewhere, or is it cheaper for me, for instance, in this case where I'm going, okay, for Le Prince's brother, I want his marriage papers, professional papers, everything that's available in an old archive. Is it cheaper for me to go to France, try and figure out what that stuff is, or is it cheaper for me to get someone who knows how to do that and pay them a decent rate, and it takes them 1 day and I get it, and, you know, they got to go in the morgue papers. Someone in New York's got to find me the trial transcripts that I can read through. Then I'll go to New York and read through them. And you're always kind of racing against the clock. And I'm my things, I try and put everything in a chronological timeline, and then you can see where it connects and hinges.
Sure.
And figure it out. So I needed to populate that. And that's kind of how I went about it.
And can you talk about your next project yet?
Yeah, my next book is about this time in 1969, where these two young dudes in California. There's this guy called Young Guy, who's the first film school graduate to ever make a film for a studio, called Francis Coppola, and he's making this little film for Warner Brothers. And he gets told he's assigned this young dude who's really great at USC to be his to shadow him on this movie for a few weeks.
The George Lucas. Is it?
And George Lucas turns up, and they both have this vision for how they're going to revolutionize Hollywood.
This is
I guess
1138. Is it?
What's no? Coppola was working on a weird thing called Finian's Rainbow, terrible musical.
I do remember reading about this though. That's
and so they shadow on it, and then they go make this film on the road, and then decide to go to San Francisco and start the studio. And essentially, I'm oversimplifying it, but that splits into into Coppola trying this artistic thing called American Zoetrope, and Lucas trying this more commercial thing that becomes Lucasfilm, and Lucas drifting away from Coppola towards this even younger guy he's met that he really likes called Steven Spielberg, and how they think of movies.
Right.
And so that book is kind of like it's the pitch for it is that I've always thought Easy Riders, Raging Bulls was nonsense, and this is my rewriting of that period.
It sounds exciting, and you don't have a timeline on that yet, right? A couple of years.
I literally have to hand it in January 15th, 2024, and this time I'm going to try and be on time.
All right. So my final question, I know we went over time a little bit, but I need to know, because you're a film producer and because I told you that the book is so incredibly cinematic, are there plans to adapt this into a film?
It's been optioned by a producer in France,
Okay.
And we're reaching out to people, and I kind of had to make a call. I kind of think in France, they have the audience and the public funding to make period stuff like this.
Wow, great. It'll be incredibly riveting, as
knock on wood.
Hopefully as riveting and absorbing as your book.
Thank you.
So if you would like to learn more about Paul and his work, please visit his website, paulfisherauthor.com. It's in the chat. The book is The Man Who Invented Motion Pictures, A True Tale of Obsession, Murder, and the Movie. Paul, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and have a great weekend.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone.